welcome Tiffany Starr.
Hello, Dryden. Wow, I forgot my table. I'm just going to set this next to me. Thank you. That's perfect. Thank you for that lovely introduction, for the wonderful music. It's so nice to see a gathering like this on such a beautiful evening. We're in a really intense time in our world. And we're experiencing major acts of gun violence at really high rates in our communities. It's hard to avoid hearing about it, and it seems like every week we're absorbing a new terrible tragedy. It hasn't even been a week since the Highland Park incident happened. In addition to the major newsworthy mass shootings, our country experiences 110 deaths by gun every day. And hundreds more are wounded and witness and survive, like I did. I'm assuming if you're here today, you're affected by the levels of gun violence that we're seeing in our society. And I want to thank you for coming. And I want you to take a moment to look around and acknowledge that you are not alone in that care and concern for what's going on. So I really want to thank you for being here today as we discuss this very difficult topic. As Hummy mentioned, the United Methodist Church, which is where I grew up, has a clear call to action, and ending gun violence is one of their calls to action. So I also want to thank the Dryden United Methodist Church for responding to that call to action and hosting this today. As Hummy said, I'm Tiffany Starr, and I am a gun violence survivor. Every time I hear about gun violence in its many forms, I'm deeply moved and I'm hurt because I know the lifetime of challenges that will face those who are experiencing it. I'm here to share my experiences with you in the hopes that what I've learned from living with trauma, the trauma that comes with gun violence, and what I've learned about taking care of myself, and what I've learned about taking action will help you navigate this ongoing problem in our society. I hope you learned some things that will help you cope, as well as find some hope, knowing that there are actions we can take to protect ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities. So Hummy gave you a little bit of an introduction of what happened with my family. For those of you who don't know, as she mentioned, my dad, Steve, was a football coach, a 6th grade teacher, and a well-known guy around our community. When I was 15 and my older sisters were 17, my older sister Amber had exited what we didn't know had been an abusive relationship. And over a period of time after that relationship ended, it became clear to our family that he was a very dangerous person. And we sought help, and unfortunately at that time, the help that was available was not enough that we needed. And on an early morning, he did break into our house using a gun to shoot the locks off the doors to our home. And my dad was able to get to my sister and pull her to safety, but in the process, he was killed. The rest of us were able to get out of the house and survive that day, but we lost an incredibly important person in our lives. In my life, my dad was a gentle giant, is how I describe him. He was funny. He had giant hands that you couldn't help but love when you shook them. He had a way of shaking your hand that would shake your whole body. And as a kid, to me, he just represented everything that was safety and love, as a parent. But on the day he was killed, in an instant, our lives were just forever changed, and none of us would ever be the same. As a family, we would never be the same. For me, my childhood ended that day, and I learned to live with PTSD. That's when it began. What is PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. So I want to give you a little information about trauma and the effects of trauma, because as I continue to tell you about my journey, I'm going to kind of share some of the traumatic things that affected my life, or the way that trauma affected my life. And a lot of what I share comes from one of the leading researchers in trauma. His name is Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. So how often do you hear the word trauma? We kind of hear it a lot these days, right? Almost 30 years ago when this happened to us, trauma wasn't really a word that we knew about or heard about like we do today. Today we throw it around almost kind of casually. Oh my gosh, that was so traumatizing, right? We kind of hear it a lot, but what does it really mean? So technically, true trauma comes from an event or series of events that are life-threatening, and the event is so upsetting that it overwhelms you and you're unable to function in the face of this threat. So there's a part of our brain that's responsible for our survival instincts, and that kicks in and takes over. And there are actual chemical changes that take place in your brain, in your body, and you do not have control over this. This is when your fight or flight, freeze, faint system kicks in, and that's our sympathetic nervous system. So again, we're not consciously aware of this happening. We don't know how we're going to respond in a life-threatening situation. That is programmed as, and we are animals, like every other animal creature, that's programmed in us, and it happens the way it happens when it happens. And one of the big takeaways that people have grabbed onto when I teach, like in more depth trauma trainings to other folks, is that trauma is not the event. Trauma is the way that we respond to an event. And that little part of your brain that is usually quiet, that helps you decide what's dangerous or safe, continues to send signals that I'm in danger. And even though the event itself is over and you have reached safety, you continue to react to things as if you're in danger all the time. And once that part of your brain is activated in this way, it's very difficult to deactivate and get it to go back into a rest mode, and it only come out when it's needed. So what does that really look like in real life? By no means an exhaustive list, but some of the common responses that people have is feeling fearful or anxious, feeling sad, worrying, guilt, difficulty concentrating, sleeping, hypervigilance, irritability, intrusive thoughts, avoiding people and places that bring back difficult memories, and more. Physical symptoms also develop. Headaches, stomach aches, eating or sleeping too much or too little, exhaustion, inability to relax, holding tension through the body. These are things that I have experienced most of my life. So how the heck am I up here today, right? How do people who experience these things move through that and get to a place in their life where they can stand up in front of people, which is not for everyone, but I happen to sign up for that. It's really been a journey, and I'm going to go ahead and share a little bit of that journey with you. So to be perfectly frank, the early years were extremely, extremely difficult. Right off the bat, I knew I was not the same, and I didn't know if I ever would be. I had an instant knowing of the suffering of the world. Immediately, I could feel other people's pain all the time. I felt constantly threatened and in danger, and very few places felt safe. And I had an incredibly difficult time sleeping. I was afraid to fall asleep. Returning to the high school environment was super tough. I felt like a spectacle and invisible all at the same time. And I wanted to fit in and be my normal self and get back to my activities and my friends and my life. But I was in this constant state of overwhelm. And I was preoccupied with this really deep sense of needing to do something about what happened to me. And it was really frustrating because at that point in time, I had no idea what to do. And I just really hoped that I would someday find that. And I was grieving. I was impossibly sad and deeply heartbroken. This carried into my college years, and I attended the University of Maryland, which is an absolutely beautiful campus with impeccable landscaping, and it was a place that I was always happy to be. It always felt fresh and inviting. It was a great place. I absolutely loved my school, but I continued to struggle with my trauma. Socially, events were really hard. I was scared and scanning rooms for threats at all times. I was making sure that I knew where exits were so I could run out. And this was all just happening inside of me. And I was pretty much keeping that to myself most of the time. It was a risk to join friends and join in social engagements. If I wanted to go watch a movie, I didn't know what kind of violence might be in that, and nobody else was really noticing how much that affected me. So it was really disturbing, and I had to be careful. It took many years, many years of being in uncomfortable situations where I could start to ingest media in a way that didn't feel terrible. Educationally, things were different too. I learned really differently. Things that had made sense before just didn't click for me anymore. I had brain fog and confusion. My memory was bad. I had a really hard time trying to concentrate. I had started school as a math major. I had always been, more adept at math, and I really liked math, but it just didn't make sense anymore. And the words, when I would try to go study, the words and the numbers would swim on the page, and I just couldn't find my way through it. It was really frustrating. But nevertheless, I coped, right? I made it through. I kept going. And how did I do that? Well, I had a really solid foundation. I was extremely fortunate to have a really solid family foundation and a loving childhood that included my faith. And I leaned heavily on my relationship with God, and I prayed a lot. I definitely would not know how I would have gotten through those first 3 years without my faith. I started therapy almost immediately, and I put a lot of effort into it. Here's the thing about therapy. As a social worker, let me tell you. You get out what you put in. You have to work at it. And let me tell you, it is hard work. I have done it almost my entire life. I keep up with it today, but it's necessary for me to be here today. Relationships. So relationships were hard, but I had some really beautiful friends and people in my life who ushered me through when I was struggling. And some of them are here today. And I met the person who would become my husband a little less than a year after the event. So that was an incredibly stable, loving relationship that also really worked in my favor. And I found a passion. In college, I changed my major because math was becoming so challenging for me to women's studies. It's a pretty big leap from one end, kind of the other end of the spectrum. But I had taken a women's history class, and it led me to this understanding of how the historical context of gender-based violence and domestic violence had played a role in what had happened in my life. And suddenly I had this light bulb of inspiration that said, oh my gosh, this is my pathway. This is how I'm going to find how I'm going to do something about what happened in my life. I know this is it. I'm going to get there now. I'm going to do something about what happened. And I did have some of my first activism experiences in college, mostly around reproductive rights. But what also happened when I was in college was there was a the first major school shooting, Columbine. I remember exactly where I was when it happened. I was standing in line, waiting to get my room assignment for the next year dorm situation. And I remember standing there and the news came up on the TV screen, and I remember being just frozen and looking around and realizing that I was the only one having that reaction. It was so disturbing to me. I was nauseous, I was sad, I was angry, and I felt helpless. And I knew that what I had experienced was what all of those survivors from this situation were now going to live with. And I desperately wanted to do something about it. I wanted to hop on a plane and fly there and sit with them and say, I get it, I know what's going to happen here, let me be with you. But I had no pathway to doing anything like that yet. So I kept up with my path of finishing my education and focusing on women's issues. And I had faith that God would lead me there. I graduated in 2001, and I quickly got married and started life. And mixed into the happiness of that time, honestly, were the painful reminders of my trauma. My dad not being at my wedding. And, every time there was a stressful event, finding a job and getting started working, and with all of the regular everyday stressors, for me, they weren't everyday stressors. They took me from what would normally be like, oh, I'm nervous, to like, I don't know how to handle this. And I was constantly living in that heightened state of like, I don't know what to do here. So it was a really stressful time. And my husband happened to travel for work. Not all the time, but it happened often enough. And it was a terrible time for me. I didn't just think something was going to happen while he was gone. I knew it. I was convinced of it. I knew somebody was going to break into my house. I would lay awake, listening for it, waiting for it, and go to work exhausted every day. Eventually, I learned to stop staying at home, and I started staying with friends because it was that bad. So I kept up with my therapy, and I was always moving through, what can I do to heal through all of this? What can I do, and what can I learn about trauma so that I can understand what's happening to me?